So several years ago, I participated in a reading group at the Hudson Area Library. That's my local library here in Hudson, New York. And we worked through a range of writings by James Baldwin. Since he was as an author I'd not read in several decades, I was intrigued at how resilient and on target his comments about race and America remained. A big takeaway for me was the observation that racism is a white people's problem. So I want to investigate this a little bit, and here's a little bit more from James Baldwin. This is a quote from The Fire Next Time. To accept one's past, one's history, is not the same thing as drowning in it. It is learning how to use it. An invented past can never be used. It cracks and crumbles under the pressures of life, like clay in a season of drought. Now, Baldwin was actually addressing his American Negroes, African Americans at the time. But I think this notion applies very, very much to white people in the United States. So why is this title Embracing White Supremacy? Well, racism is something that we're pretty familiar with, the belief that different races possess distinct differences, characteristics, and qualities, and so on, and that some are superior or inferior. But white supremacy is quite specific. It's a belief that white people constitute a superior race and should therefore dominate society, typically to the exclusion or detriment of racial and ethnic groups. The thing that should be noted here is that many would argue that this is particularly from the founders of the country, peculiar Northern European notion. But it certainly has informed much of what's happened in the last 250 years or so. So here are some of the topics that we'll talk about. Thanksgiving in 1621, the Trail of Tears, which was the forced migration of 5 Indian nations from the southeast out to central North America, the Reconstruction after the Civil War, the emergence of Jim Crow laws, and really the establishment of apartheid in America. And the settling of the West, which, as you'll see, involved essentially the expropriation of indigenous peoples' lands all across the continent. And surprisingly, perhaps, FDR and the New Deal. And they played a central role, really, in the modern American segregation. And not to be left out, but our generation is very, very much tied up in this through the incarceration nation, the growth of our jailed population. So let's start with Thanksgiving. I've been thinking about the memories and stories I've received since my earliest education in the discovery of America. I put that in quotes for you. It's settling by brave, energetic people who turned a wilderness into a civilization. The Pilgrims coming to Plymouth to build a society where they could practice their religion in peace. The emergence of freedoms, freedom of enterprise, speech, religion, and boundless opportunity in the spreading settlements as manifest destiny swept across the country. Then, in my lifetime, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So let me read a fairly extensive piece that's a description of the first, the arrival of the Pilgrims. Quote, contrary to the Thanksgiving myth, the Pilgrim Wampanoag encounter was no first contact meeting. Rather, it followed a string of bloody episodes since 1524, in which European explorers seized coastal Wampanoags to be sold into overseas slavery or to be trained as interpreters and guides. The Wampanoags reached out to the Pilgrims not only despite this violent history, but also partly because of it. In 1616, a European ship conveyed an epidemic disease to the Wampanoags that over the next 3 years took a staggering toll on their population. Afterward, the Narragansett tribe to the west began raiding the Wampanoags. To answer this threat, Osamequin wanted the English to serve the Wampanoags both as military allies and as source of European weaponry. His use of Squanto as a go-between with the Pilgrim Plymouth settlers also stemmed from the Wampanoags' history of being raided by Europeans. Squanto knew English because he had spent years in captivity in Spain and England before orchestrating an unlikely return home shortly before the Mayflower's arrival. Such dark themes are hardly the stuff of Americans' grade school pageants. Then we come to the Trail of Tears. This is an incident that begins in the 1830s and lasts almost to the end of that decade, in which 5 Indian nations were forced out of Alabama, Georgia, and parts of Mississippi, and forced to march 800 miles to the present-day Oklahoma. And just for reference, 800 miles is roughly the distance between my hometown of Hudson, New York, and Chicago, or Seattle to San Francisco. So it is a very long way. And many, many people died of starvation and disease along the way. This facilitated the expansion of slavery-based cotton plantations, and many Indian removals followed, but too many to observe here. And here you can see a little map that shows where the dark green original land of the 5 nations, and then Oklahoma on the left. So there was another incident that follows along, which is the failure of Northern whites after the Civil War to do the right thing. When you consider that enslaved people and poor whites had really made the land of the South productive, it was not the plantation owners who did it, it was actually the enslaved people and poor whites who turned the land into productive land. So at the end of the Civil War, you would think that given the fact that the plantation owners and the elites had attempted to secede from the United States, that they would take the obvious action of turning the land over to the people who had made it productive. But that's not what happened. Northern whites caved in, and ultimately the land remained in the hands of the secessionists. And this set the table for a period of peonage in the sharecropping system that lasted for almost 80 years, really until World War II. And here's a couple of images of sharecroppers, a thoroughly miserable, exploited life. The second failure of Northern whites was that following the end of Reconstruction in 1877, they essentially turned a blind eye to the Southern states' elites and politicians who constructed the Jim Crow laws. These were the segregationist laws. They really were a totalitarian system of apartheid that lasted really into the 1960s in many ways. And one thing to take note of is that the Democratic Party was beholden to the Dixiecrats for their control of Congress and the White House at various points through this whole period. So the bargain was very, very clear. And then we come to the settling of the West. And the Homestead Act of 1862 gave away roughly 10% of the land area of the United States to settlers. The only thing that should be taken note of is, as with much of the other settling or civilizing of North America, the lands were not empty, and there was, in fact, already a civilization here. Just it wasn't white people's civilization. And so they seized the land from Indians. And one of the telling incidents here is that herds of buffalo, which was a primary source of food for Indians, were systematically slaughtered. explicitly genocidal policy, in my view. And here's a little story from a magazine article in the Atlantic. The Army wasn't in the business of guiding hunting trips for soft-skinned Wall Streeters, but it was in the business of controlling the Native Americans in the area. And that meant killing buffalo. One colonel, 4 years earlier, had told a wealthy hunter who felt a shiver of guilt after he had shot 30 bulls in one trip, quote, "Kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo is dead. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone." And here you can see the piles of hides. Millions of buffaloes were killed off in the span of 10 or 15 years. So now we can jump forward a little bit to the Depression era and Roosevelt and the New Deal. And this is really kind of what was a surprising story to me when I first came on this maybe 10 years ago. As I've noted earlier, the Dixiecrats were really crucial to the Democratic Party. And Northern whites acceded to their demands across the board. And not surprisingly, many of those demands were essentially the same segregationist Jim Crow stuff that was widespread across the South. And under New Deal laws, these were spread all across the country. So Social Security excluded farm workers and domestics, and these, of course, were largely African-American occupations. And the various housing acts codified segregated housing through redlining and racial covenants all across the country. And these patterns still exist to this day. Here's a red line map from 1938, and there were 261 of these city maps made. So if you live in even a medium-sized city in the United States, you can go to the web and find an equivalent map for your city. And you'll probably observe that most of the red stuff, which is the hazardous area, which is where African Americans and Mexicans live, are still segregated. So, and then we come to something that's perhaps a bit off topic in a way, but de facto means a state of affairs that's true in fact, but that is not officially sanctioned. So it's stuff that happens. In contrast, de jure means a state of affairs that's in accordance with law. That is, it's officially sanctioned. And for decades, lawyers and the legal system and judges and so on, they've hidden tackling the issue of segregation and racism in American life behind the argument that, oh, it's de facto. And you can almost hear it in the back of your mind. After all, people like to live with their own kind. Oh, and here's a great book on this whole topic of the establishment of segregation all across the country under the housing laws of the Great Depression and the New Deal. And it's Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law. And in fact, you can search readily on YouTube for lectures and interviews with Rothstein. So America's number one. And in this case, it's in incarceration. As you can see from this graphic, we far outstrip just about every other country in the world in the rate at which we incarcerate people, put them in jail. The thing that's interesting about this is not a new phenomenon. It really starts first with Nixon's war on drugs, but he really wasn't very effective in this matter. It came to Ronald Reagan, who in the two terms of his presidency more than doubled the prison population in the United States, a true mountain of an achievement for him. But here's the thing that makes it particularly a tool of white supremacy. You'll notice that for white people, the incarceration rate is about 214 per 100,000. For black people, it's more than 5 times that much. And for Hispanics, more than twice. So it's a policy that is highly racialized and really a tool of white supremacy. But we're also number one, so we are number one in incarceration. But we're also number one in police shootings. Once again, the U.S. is way, way out ahead of everybody else in the developed world at the rate at which our police officers shoot people. And by this, I mean kill civilians. We're not talking about all the other crap that goes on with police. And not surprisingly, Black Americans are killed at a phenomenally higher rate. So if you're Black, it's 5.8 per million per year, whereas for whites, it's less than half of that. So it's very, very much scattered towards African Americans. So I think one of the points I want to make here is that we really need to formulate a more accurate set of national narratives. And I'm not suggesting that this presentation should be taken as more than just a prod to think about and do some reading about the fact of white supremacy. You can, of course, take a look at the 1619 project from the New York Times, and there's videos that are available on YouTube that will give you a lot of information about this history. And we really need to embrace this. We need to take on responsibility for the facts of white supremacy and deal with it in concrete ways. So thanks for watching.